Welcome and thank you for joining our panel today, Building Trust, Evidence in its Communication. I'm George Hripcsak, Chair of Biomedical Informatics at Columbia and Director of the Columbia OHDSI Coordinating Center. First, I want to welcome our panelists, Amy Abernethy, Principal Deputy Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Patti Brennan, Director of the U.S. National Library of Medicine of NIH, Magdalena Skipper, Editor-in-Chief of Nature, Deborah Nelson, Associate Professor of Investigative Reporting at the University of Maryland and freelance journalist at Reuters, and Roni Caryn Rabin, New York Times staff writer with a focus on health and science. Our format is, I'll give a brief introduction, and then we'll cover a set of points and counterpoints. After that, we'll take questions from the audience where you enter them through your Q&A button. So there have long been questions about the reliability of medical evidence. In the area of observational research, that is, where you do a retrospective study on electronic databases, OHDSI in its presentations often shows examples from the literature with contradictory results, even for the same exact question on the same database published in the same month. OHDSI also published a paper showing that 85% of published studies are positive. That publication bias hides the negative studies that are necessary to gauge whether the positive ones are truly positive. Then COVID-19 came along. It was a new infection, inflicting enormous suffering with little known about it. The scientific community roared into action, quickly generating evidence from observational data and beginning numerous trials. The editorial and peer review process was overwhelmed, and the urgent need for evidence required rapid assessment of the study's rigor and importance. Highly publicized retractions and corrections contributed to a general feeling that a large proportion of the published work was substandard and misleading, and in fact misleading the nation. The OHDSI community strives to avoid substandard work. It does several things. It provides a public protocol before beginning research. It reports results from multi-institutional studies. It verifies its results with a full range of diagnostics. It executes numerous data quality checks, and it reports on data provenance of each of its data sites. Such rigor takes time, of course, and so OHDSI is still at work on COVID. Now, generating evidence sits in a larger context, including the stakeholders who require the evidence, those who fund such work, and those responsible for assessing the results and communicating them both to researchers and to the public. We're here today as a panel to talk to the OHDSI community to broaden our perspective on evidence generation and to explore strategies for moving forward to deliver trustworthy evidence. As I mentioned, we'll start off with a series of points and counterpoints. I'm going to start off with a general point and counterpoint that will serve as an opening, and each panelist is welcome to describe their role and interest. First, the point. The scientific community took on an unprecedented challenge and produced observational evidence at a higher than ever rate. And while some studies were faulty, on the whole, it produced useful information that benefited the fight against COVID-19. The counterpoint is based on poor, misleading evidence that has been published both in the past and now for COVID-19, the scientific process must undergo major revision. And this is the first point I want to address to our panelists. And Amy, I'd like to start with you as an important consumer at the FDA of evidence.
First of all, I want to thank you for having me here with you today. And I'm commenting both from my role as Principal Deputy Commissioner at FDA, as well as a person who's been thinking about and working in the real-world data space for a long time and a champion of the OHDSI community. And my response here sort of reflects that blended life. I see that COVID-19 brought to us an urgency for clinical evidence to try and understand how to take care of the person with COVID and how to plan for our futures. And you know, there's a massive amount that we needed to know quickly, and the OHDSI community, as well as many real-world data communities, really mobilized around that task with this critical number of questions to answer. We have to acknowledge that observational research real world data, real world evidence should not be in place of the critical need for clinical trials, but rather as a core complement in terms of totality of the evidence and thinking about where is the appropriate role of observational research. That being said, I tend to be very positive about the important role of observational research, of real world data and real world evidence to serve in quickly addressing questions related to COVID-19. We saw observational research help us understand the living history of COVID-19, and OHDSI community has been critical for that. Helps us understand inclusive totality of the evidence. And what I mean by that is being able to understand populations that may or may not have been studied within the context of clinical trials, as well as starting to understand how medical products may perform in early work, and also fills in gaps from clinical trials, whether that's continued longitudinal evaluation after a person has been randomized, helping us with real world comparators, helping us understand populations not studying the clinical trials. We're also helping us understand how drugs that are substitutes, such as beyond dexamethasone, may be performing. I say all of this, though, with a huge but, and that's what we have seen within our community with retractions and a number of concerns as it relates to information that is both in the lay press as well as in the published space that may not be pointing in the direction of critical information for COVID-19. And it is critical that we maintain both a commitment to best science. We also maintain a commitment towards transparency and cross-checking each other. Within the evidence accelerator community, which OHDSI actively participates, we've developed a set of principles of working together that allows us to talk about the importance of what I call ruthless transparency and how to make sure that we are able to cross-check each other's work in order to ensure that this work does continue to positively inform the management of COVID-19.
Very good, thank you, Amy. Next, let's go to Patti from the National Library of Medicine.
Thanks very much, George, and Amy, thanks for that great kickoff set of remarks. I'm Patti Brennan, I'm the director of the National Library of Medicine, and we have a strong interest in OHDSI. We've provided support to many investigators across the country and are happy to see this community growing widely. We also, though, are responsible for developing and delivering a wide range of research products, including, as you well know, literature as well as data sets. 1,700 women and men work hard to produce this every day. And we do challenge ourselves constantly to anticipate the trends so that the National Library of Medicine stays abreast with the way scientific communication is moving forward. I believe that under COVID-19, we have been challenged in ways that we haven't been before. In the past, changes emerged slowly, maybe using accession numbers or maybe using ORCID IDs. This has been slowly adopted by the community, but some have emerged so quickly. Data supplements and appended to PubMed Central manuscripts is a good example of something that changed quite rapidly in our community. But now we're at a point where there's a great need, both by professionals as well as lay people, as well as the scientific community, to have data available quickly, to have scientific results published fast. We're very, very proud of the fact that by January the 13th, we had an annotated version of the virus available that could be widely shared. But I think today we're really talking about scientific papers. Now, science itself is self-correcting, and we're well aware that the results from any single scientific paper may be publicly lauded as the next breakthrough, and then 2 days later, challenged as being perhaps not properly analyzed or refuted. Our challenge as an engine of discoverability and sustainability is to work with scientists, the publishing community, and the general media to improve the awareness of the many modes of publication. Scientific communication is much more of a conversation than a status report. Now, before I close, I want to say I'm going to put a plea out to work together. We have an opportunity to work with the academic community around the country and around the world to move the process of academic awarding and enhancement. We need to realign the reward structure that has increasingly emphasized first out, early out discoveries over long-term sustainable work. In any type of a health crisis as we're faced with right now, we need to recognize that information will be moving quickly, and we need to recognize it's moving in a manner different than a long-term sustainable career of scientific communication. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patti. Very good. Magdalena, next, for a point of view from the journal Nature.
Thank you. So it's a great pleasure to be here, part of this panel on a very important topic. And my comments will actually reflect a lot of what was said already, but I will talk very broadly, as is befitting, since I represent Nature, a multidisciplinary journal here. So I would say that the current pandemic does indeed represent an unprecedented challenge in modern research. In the past, in cases of more local epidemics, research was much slower to be disseminated, and it was a problem. For example, the pathogen genome sequences needed to be available as the infections spread in the population, so that the dynamics of these infections can be understood in real time and appropriate measures can be taken in a timely fashion. So almost 50% of all available scientific work relating to COVID-19 has first appeared on a preprint server, so very rapidly. But if you compare that to the 2014 Ebola or the 2015 Zika outbreaks, in those cases, only 5% of published papers appeared as preprints first. And going back to 2003, for the SARS outbreak, more than 90% of papers, now not preprints, but papers on that topic, appeared after the outbreak ended. It's a very illustrative comparison. So I would say that the researchers have embraced the challenge. The funders allowed funding to be repurposed in a really timely fashion, and publishers made relevant publications freely available. Now, on the subject of incorrect studies, in my view, given the volume of publications, it was inevitable that some papers ended up being retracted. Patti already said science progresses through self-correction. This self-correction is a positive aspect of science communication. It's important to note that these retractions are very rapid, and this in itself is a positive development. What we should do better, a better job of, is explaining to the general media and the general public how science is done, that it's not immutable, that the fact is, in fact, that it changes its position when new data become available, when they come to light. And in fact, this very fact is an indication that it is functioning as it should be. So I would say that based on how research has been done and communicated so far during the pandemic, I do not see any substantive reason to suggest that the scientific process must undergo revision, certainly not in the sense that anything serious has been amiss. In fact, the increased use of preprints and rapid and open data sharing are certainly positive trends, which I very much hope are here to stay.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. Now to Deborah for investigative journalism in academics.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. So I'm an investigative journalist, as you heard, who relies on good science to do what I do, and also has uncovered my share of bad science. And so, you know, the problems we're seeing right now are not new. But as with, I think, so many things, the pandemic has put them in stark relief. You know, just as the virus takes advantage of our physical vulnerabilities to wreak havoc, I feel like it's doing the same thing with our social institutions. So it would be a tragic missed opportunity with weak spots now in plain view, not to do something about them. You know, we need to, and we need to do the same sort of damage assessment and corrective in journalism as well. I like that OHDSI, I like the collaborative approach that maintains quality control by sharing information and sharing it early and often. You know, I'm a journalist, that's what I'm all about. From, you know, data sources to methodology and ultimately dissemination of findings. It doesn't abandon the peer review and publication model, but just improves on it. I hope that people don't decide the answer for science is to retreat to the old ways, and I'm not hearing that here, so that's really assuring. You know, the keeping everything under lock and key for years, awaiting peer review and publication, that would have been disastrous in this situation. We'd only be learning how to deal with this pandemic in the middle of the next one. For us journalists, the preprint universe with its wet ink findings and real-time online critiques from topic experts has been an essential resource for keeping the public informed and holding officials accountable. It's really a valuable but a very flawed tool, right? In my job, I generally working on projects for Reuters where I'll spend a couple months on a story or a couple years. I have the benefit of time to really analyze studies, consult experts, and fact check. I'm interested to hear from Roni. She's really working on the front lines, doing some amazing work at Mach speed. So let's hear what she has to say.
Thank you. I feel like I've been covering COVID all my life, and it's really only been about 10 months because we really were jumping on it right from the beginning in January. I've been a health reporter writing for the Times for about 15 years, and we have changed a lot of the way we do things. Before this year, it was unheard of for us to report on a study that hadn't been published in a peer-reviewed journal. And even so, we would look at it several different ways. We'd do our own peer review. We'd be talking to scientists who could look at it and turn it 6 ways around and try to get perspectives. We don't have the luxury to do that anymore, as has been noted. And we also have every reporter from every desk in the paper involved in this coverage, not just health and science reporters. We do try to cross-check and we'll often be reading other people's stories, but we've got everyone, foreign correspondents, political correspondents, business desk, everyone's involved. We've had music critics and sports writers doing this reporting. And I actually went back to look at what we knew and when we knew it in terms of disseminating to the broad public. And I was impressed. Now, I say this with caveats, and I know we'll get to this later, but I was actually impressed with how some very important seminal information was actually available early on, disseminated early on, and how accurate it proved to be. And I'll just talk for a minute about the one thing of the asymptomatic transmission, which we've come back to again and again, but we actually knew about this by the end of January. We knew that people without symptoms or before they were or prior to development of symptoms could transmit this disease, and we understood that this was going to be an Achilles heel in terms of containment of the illness. And we also understood when all the testing shortages came in that prioritizing people with symptoms for testing was going to be problematic because of this. So translating this into policy for various reasons was another things broke down, but it's really pretty impressive at how much we knew early on, and that also goes for vulnerable populations, underlying medical conditions, the vulnerability of men and elderly and people of color. All that was really coming out very, very quickly, and a lot of it has stood up. So there's a lot to be saying. I do want to note that I think someone else alluded, we have a vast and cacophonous media environment right now. A lot of voices are being heard, a lot of false messages are being trumpeted. So the public is understandably confused, and the communications from our own government public health scientists have been confusing, contradictory at times, and politicized. So I think there's been a lot of confusion because of that.
Thank you, Roni. I'd like to go back around again, but because the topic of preprint archive servers has come up, let's go straight into our second point and do it directly, and then we can go around to other topics. So the point was enormous number, and you've already covered it somewhat, but I still want to go around again and I have an additional piece to it. An enormous number of studies, including observational research and small clinical trials, were placed on preprint servers with no review and reported on in the press. This must be better controlled. Counterpoint, the archives provided a legitimate means of supplying early results, and the press well understood the limitations of the archives and generally reported the caveats. adding to that is in a context where there's competing, loud noise coming out of it feels like a lot of competition in the news media. When you have preprint servers with a lot of things being presented, you can select out what you want to report now, even more easily than when you wait for peer-reviewed results to come out. There's more to choose from to build whatever story you want to present. So I'd like to just go around a little bit more on the preprint servers since they're so important. I'm going to start off back with Magdalena.
Thank you. So during the pandemic, the time of a pandemic, when research findings can inform policy making literally on a daily basis, rapid dissemination of information is really paramount. But preprints themselves are obviously not new. We must remember that. Initially, of course, they were in the physical sciences community, and then subsequently, probably some close to 10 years ago now, by life scientists, and now by the clinical community. Such early sharing is absolutely crucial during the pandemic, especially when these studies are accompanied by open sharing of data so that others can immediately build on the findings. It must at the same time be realized that such preprints do not represent peer-reviewed, vetted research which subsequently appears in the scientific and clinical literature. And this distinction is important. From the perspective of Nature, which of course is a multidisciplinary journal, I can say that we have seen preprints as coexisting with paper. Last year, across Springer Nature, we took the step towards actively encouraging our authors to deposit preprints before or at the time of submission to our journal, so that not just to Nature, but to all journals that Springer Nature publishes, which is some 3,000 journals. We recognize the value of early sharing of information and of further refine journal submissions. And collectively, as a community, I think we can do a better job of educating the general media and the general population about what is a preprint as compared to what a peer-reviewed paper is. And in fact, several reputable news outlets make this distinction very clear today. You know, I'm based in the UK, so let me give you an example of the BBC, where perhaps a year ago, it was rare to hear the word preprint, whereas now reporters make it quite clear whether they report on a peer-reviewed research or a preprint, sorry.
Should I just jump in here?
Roni.
And I'm really sorry, Magdalena, because sometimes you were skipping out and I wasn't hearing everything. I do maybe want to make a contrarian point, which is that the two biggest fiascos of COVID research publication were studies that were not placed on Open Archives preprint servers, but rather in peer-reviewed journals. In fact, two of the most prestigious and prominent peer-reviewed journals, The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. They did go through peer review. They were published in May within weeks of one another by the same group, very small group of researchers. And within days, they provoked a furor, and the rapid pace did continue. The journals were responsive. They printed notes of concern, and they quickly retracted both studies. To this day, the individual who claimed to have this database with the raw data has not made it public, so we still don't know if this database exists or if these studies were authentic or not. But I think that had they been posted on a preprint server, they would never have been published in these journals. So many scientists would have laid eyes on them and quickly come up with the critiques that question their fundamental truthfulness. And the archives actually provide for fantastic universal peer review, and I think you alluded to this. I couldn't hear everything you were saying, and the authors of these two retracted journal papers, in fact, did publish another paper on a preprint archive about ivermectin, saying that it could be a lifesaver in COVID and dramatically reduce deaths. That got so much attention immediately that it never went any further and was pulled down from that preprint server. But I think that what this tells us is that if there's a reckoning that's due, it may be due for the process of peer review. It's a very secretive process. It lacks transparency. It's usually reliant on 3 or 4 experts. They don't look at the raw data generally. They're not supposed to question authenticity. That's not their job. And they know that their editor is interested in this paper, so that introduces some bias. Now you've got that process really condensed, where peer reviewers are being asked to turn things around in 24 hours, 36 hours. They themselves are usually busy with their own research or treating patients. So I think peer review also needs a second look.
Deborah?
Yeah, so I'd like to raise a related issue. I think we have to recognize the empty chair in this room. Social media. You know, it's not just journalists and scientists who have access to these preprints, right? You know, whether your science is good or bad, whether we get it right or wrong, social media is often running and reaching far more people than Nature, Reuters, and the New York Times combined. You know, in the olden days, journal editors and science reporters served as gatekeepers, but the internet has no gates. So I just wanted to, I don't have answers here, but I wanted to raise some questions. Maybe smarter people have ideas. How do we address that? I mean, is it enough for us to do our jobs responsibly? That of course is step one, but does our duty to inform require us to anticipate and try to counteract those who don't? I mean, there's this danger in treating inform. We are, you know, part of our job is to publish and inform the public. To treat that as a passive verb, we publish and people are informed. It just seems like this state today, if we're going to combat misinformation, intentional and disinformation, that's got to be an active verb. Yeah. So what do we do? I think if we, you know, ignore what people, you know, it's like finding the signal for all the noise is really hard. You know, how do we dial up the signal for people?
Patti?
Well, thanks very much for talking about the word find, Deborah, because that's something I want to pick up on. As you all are well aware, the NIH does accept preprints as interim products of research as acceptable evidence of progress towards research goals. And yet we had no systematic way of making them discoverable. You had to figure out which archive in which state and which country this was published. As of June of this year, the NIH launched a preprint pilot. We're beginning first with the COVID literature and then go on. Preprints will be deposited in PubMed Central and indexed in PubMed with very clear banner ads, very clear XML indicating this is a preprint. What we're doing is a little bit risky because we're taking our prized reputation as the archival source of trusted health information and moving it to this more ephemeral interaction. We're working very closely with some of our key preprint and archive servers and working very closely with them. We believe that opening the dialogue, the public commons of the preprint is actually going to be strengthening science, and we need to complement, not replace, but complement archival literature with this. We also want to encourage the scientific and the communications communities to recognize that there's many pieces of scientific communication that go beyond either articles or preprints. ClinicalTrials.gov, for example, stores profiles, stores protocols, stores consent forms, and has early reports of results within 1 year of the completion of a study. Figshare and other generalist research repositories and domain-specific data repositories like the Sequence Root Archive and DBGAP provide data sets. So we're moving to an environment that probably is going to be a little more difficult to create synthesis around, but there are more products in the scientific conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. And Amy?
Great. So, you know, from an FDA perspective, we always think it's important to cross-check the work that's being presented in front of us, and certainly that's part of what we do at FDA. So I'm going to actually answer this from the point of view of having worked in the real-world data space, both from the industry perspective as well as an academic for a very long time, and think about what's the problem we're trying to solve with preprints. And a lot of this is speed to publication or speed to dissemination of information because of timing of publication cycles, and also the timing that happens with peer review and editing, etc. A second thing that we're trying to solve with preprints is ability of all to participate. When I was in the health tech sector, one of the things that was quite notable to me was how when being on the sideline of health tech, it was actually hard to participate in the publication space if you didn't have sort of academic track record and sort of way of communicating that sort of typically fit within the academic style. And then the last is preprints, kind of already brought up by Roni, is this ability to cross-check. And so I think that preprints have really come into being as trying to solve some of these problems and has really been important. And as we think about speed to dissemination as the ability to have more participation, I asked myself sitting here, what do we need to also facilitate this space? And one is that I think this is partly what was said before, but to sort of put a bit of a spin on it, we need more translators who help to put preprint information into context quickly. And I almost see this as a new role that is a role that is complementary to what happens within sort of the traditional news space, and also is the sort of translator that lives on Twitter and TikTok and LinkedIn to help make sure that there's safe understanding of what's going on in the preprint space. The second thing is that something that the OHDSI community has been working on is that of what I'm going to call building blocks, because one of the problems with publication writ large is the need for detail is so important in order to understand the data set in all of its detail in full, the methods in all of their detail in full, every single author, and really the way that they presented and contributed intellectually to the content. And so the ability to have a series of different building blocks that can be put together and looked at critically in order to understand what's the information in the preprint or the scientific dissemination really mean. And the last thing I would say is that part of the other point here is that preprints have been a way of facilitating all participation in this community of science. And so being able to acknowledge that the way that we communicate as a scientific community, as an academic community, is very structured and strict. And the preprint space and also the rest of this communication space allows us to have a little bit more flexibility in that. And I suspect you're going to see more and more flexibility come into play over the next weeks to months.
Thank you, Amy. I think we could go around on this again, but let me go to the third point. And then so we have time to take some questions from the audience, and they're coming in and they're good. And then if we want to, we can come back here if there's time at the end. So the third point was with its large scale, excuse me, with its large scale techniques, OHDSI can generate thousands of results at once. The LEGEND study produced 500,000 hypotheses. So like, how do you give that to a journal and say, here's my papers, 500,000 hypotheses? It's like, who's going to review that? Obviously, this adds to reviewers' difficulty in judging evidence. The question is, the publishing community must engage more tightly with the evidence generation community, that is publishers and say groups like OHDSI, to create new models to promote evidence generation and assess the validity of the evidence. We've already seen examples of collaboration. For example, when Chicago Tribune was working on drug interactions, partnered with academics and found a new one that was very important. I don't know if it was 1 million people might potentially have been affected by it. Counterpoint is that the publishing community must remain distant from the evidence generation community to maintain scientific independence and avoid conflicts. Let me, before I completely lose my voice for a second, hand it over to Deborah.
Don't maintain distance. Come closer, come closer. Engage with us. Years ago, I was at the Washington Post investigating scientific misconduct in the gene therapy field after the death of a teenage participant. And I got a lot of help from scientists, but mostly on the QT, they were afraid to be seen talking to a journalist, let alone collaborating with one. I did calls like this one. Deb, you're on the right trail. Look in footnote 5 on page 20 of the gene therapy conference program. Can you tell me why? Just look, you'll see, click. Well, we've come a long way since then. My last 3 projects have involved upfront collaborations with scientists. The partnerships produce good journalism and good science. The most recent project led to a $300 million health and safety overhaul earlier this year of military base housing. For that one, we worked with a scientist at the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health to test homes for lead-based paint contamination. For an investigation into hospital-acquired superbug infections, Reuters science data journalist Ryan McNeil came up with an idea for using propensity score matching to calculate. I know you probably didn't think journalists knew those words, but Ryan's brilliant. To calculate the added cost to hospital stays. He took it to scientists who helped him develop the methodology, and when they applied it to their own research, they came up with a surprising finding that they published in Clinical Infectious Disease with Ryan as a co-author. My hands down favorite, just bear with me one more minute to make my pitch here, to work together. A series also with Ryan on rising sea levels. This was 2013. So science and journalists were focused on rising sea levels as a future threat at that time. I proposed to Reuters that we show that that they're already having a significant impact on coastal communities. They liked it, but honestly, I had no idea how I was going to prove that, how I was going to show it. The research at the time showed that the oceans had risen substantially, of course, but it stopped there. So I drove along the coastline, asked some people living there, have you noticed any changes? They thought there'd been an increase in tidal flooding, not just during storms, but full moons, washing away, closing roads, flooding homes and businesses, washing away chunks of shoreline. But it was all anecdotal, and no one had the numbers to prove it. I asked state, local, federal officials, they didn't keep track of that type of flooding. So that's when I thought of the tide gauges. They'd been recording water levels up and down the coastline for decades. Scientists use them to measure sea level rise. Why couldn't we use the same data to figure out how often water exceeded flood levels? Well, not so easy, I found out. Turned out there was no field for flood level in the data, and that's different at every location. So I took the problem to Ryan. He loves a challenge, discovered a database of flood levels for each tide gauge. Nobody had put the two together. He contacted William Sweet, a scientist at NOAA, and the government agency in charge of tide gauges, to talk through how to combine them. Well, it turned out William Sweet was pondering that same question. So the two of them worked together. He helped Ryan develop our methodology with dramatic results. We found increases in flooding along most of the US coastline of 900%. And in July 2014, just days apart, we published our story and Billy published his report. So Ryan and I are now working on another big data project on COVID-19 with the help of scientists around the world. I can't say much about it with Roni sitting here, but if I call you, please pick up. I'll put links to the stories I mentioned in the chat.
Patti?
Thanks very much, Jen. The National Library of Medicine works very closely with a group called the International Committee on Medical Journal Editors to actually do exactly what we're talking about here, to be able to engage with, understand best practices of communication of science, which might be culturally dependent on the field of science. But we recognize also that the traditional economic model of scientific publication is under critical review and critical consideration that it may be changing. Peer review continues to be important, but as it's implemented, we know it's not infallible. Sometimes we've heard about perverse incentives, we've heard about decision making. So as we start to think about how to build partnerships, the open science concepts that allow for conversation across the scientific process, allow for interim descriptions of scientific integrity before the results are presented, not just at the point of results, may actually prepare us better for both long-term scientific discourse as well as short-term rapid response in pandemics.
Thanks, Patti. Amy?
So kind of following from where Patti was, one of the things that we've learned is the value of formalized, safe spaces for collaboration. So the evidence accelerator we have for real world data that OHDSI participates in is run by the Reagan-Udall Foundation, which is the foundation for the FDA, which is a congressionally mandated foundation and provides a mechanism for public-private partnerships. And one of the things that I've learned is that being able to have this safe space of collaboration that allows us to simultaneously do our work of regulators as the FDA, but then participate in a meaningful way in discussions where we can be clear about each other's roles, understand each other's conflicts, and then still have the creativity and the intentionality of getting important work done. So I see the real importance of creating mechanisms that allow publishers to do their do their work in a credible way, but also make sure that we all come together to learn from each other. The other thing that I would say is that I think that all of this is reminding us that part of the reason to have these safe spaces for more collaboration and having the publication industry, so to speak, closer to the evidence generation industry is because we're going to have to acknowledge that this story is changing quickly, not just COVID, but how we disseminate information, which is likely to upend the traditional business model of publication, as well as upend the traditional model of evidence dissemination. And we need to be able to come up with mechanisms to solve for that. You started off with describing the large scale techniques of OHDSI and the massive amount of information coming out quickly and the inability to keep up with that on the evidence dissemination side. So we've got to make sure that we have creative solutions for that we have come to together. And I would argue that public-private partnerships and really safe spaces for conversation is an important way to get that work done. Thank you.
Roni?
Yeah, I mean, your projects are very exciting and intriguing, and I mean, I don't think it's an either or situation. I think, as we know, as we talked about, research findings always need to be replicated and confirmed, whether they're coming out of a joint journalism scientific investigation or a study published in a journal, and it's not one and done. The only thing holding us back on all sides, I guess, is financial constraints, which always come into investigative projects in journalism, just as they do in science. And but I think these collaborations are terrific. The other way we need collaboration also is, though, the expertise that networks like OHDSI have on these data sets and analysis data sets needs to be drawn on, I think, in the peer review process by journals. I think that's one of the things that was missing in some of the retracted studies.
Thanks, Roni. And Magdalena, and to the audience, we have Magdalena's video off to see to improve the audio bandwidth. Magdalena?
Yes, apologies. I'm having some connectivity issues. Can you hear me all right now?
Very good right now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I think I will what was said so far. From the perspective of an editor, in my view, the publishing community is part of the larger research ecosystem. As research becomes more multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary even, publishers and editors must move in step with this development to support researchers and to facilitate better evaluation of submitted material along the lines that was already mentioned, as well as greater transparency in this process. I think Roni earlier talked about how traditional peer review is not transparent, and that's of course changing. This support that we as publishers and editors can offer will be more effective if the publishing community deeply understands the challenges. For example, for us at Nature Research, it was a close collaboration with specific research communities that led to the generation of editorial reporting summaries designed to promote greater transparency and clarity of reporting methodology, data, code and adherence to ethical standards. Similarly, it's only by working with the research community we can drive standards for data sharing and data formats. So I definitely do not view any of this as a conflict or a threat to scientific independence, but rather as a collaboration. And the word collaboration, I think, was mentioned by every single panelist so far.
Very good, thank you. So let me start going through some of these great questions. How can the dry stuff of research and transparency become part of the communication to the non-research, non-clinical public in a way that underscores transparency, confidence, and quality without overwhelming the reader and creating confusion? What organizations and media do this well? Who would like to start?
Well, I'd like to begin by saying the right outlet for the right message. And then there are places to describe protocols, to describe specific outcome measures that may be different than a synthetic article. And so I think we need to start thinking about scientific communication from a more modular or distributed fashion and less of a summative fashion. Thanks.
Others?
I'll build on what Patti was just saying, and this kind of goes back to my point around there needing to be translators. I often think about this need for sort of modular dissemination of science like Patti's described, coupled with the interpretation frame that knows how to, provide an interpretive stance on the transparency and evidence, in this case, evidence of quality, right? In order to make sure that those check boxes are hit, but that the interpretation side provides the highlighting of why that's so important to begin with, why this is about reduction in bias, why this is about ensuring that the results are going to be valid, so that then you know how to interpret your results in your work. The last thing I'll say is what's interesting to me is that there is a history here within the context of the work of evidence-based medicine of teaching in a very structured way how to recognize if the scientific work was valid to begin with, and then can I trust that work and their results to incorporate into my clinical practice. That really became a way of talking about evidence-based medicine that may be useful here as a way of really making it clear that we want to first understand validity and reliability of the science before we actually incorporate it into our clinical practice.
Yeah, I think that
go ahead.
Yeah, we're I guess there are so many time and space constraints on what we're doing that we have these kind of background liners that we fall back on, and the study was not peer reviewed, and therefore it's subject to we have these type of pat lines that we include. I don't know how much they're helping the audience, how much is just helping us, and maybe we need to do more explainers on those kind of.
Can I just add one thing in response to Roni said? Sorry to jump in here, but I think that there's actually a really important task. In clinical trials, over decades, we've gotten really good at being able to be quick on the draw of what are the aspects that make this a high quality study, that makes it really efficient, Roni, for you and others to say it was randomized, it was blinded, and other features of the study design. And for observational research, we really need to be able to have those very quick, simple checkpoints that are also a part of sort of the disseminated language of observational research that we keep in our back pocket as well.
Yeah, and the limitations of studies also are usually very good at telling us what the limitations are, why it can't be applied, why we should take it with a grain of salt, whatever. But for the limitations to make it into my 800 or 1,000 word article, it can be a stretch. So that's one issue.
Anyone else want to enter, or should I move on? We have a couple of questions.
I'm going to make a quick plea for enhancing and expanding the scientific literacy of the general public, because increasingly we're asking journalists and communicators to translate things that if we had better math in 4th grade, we might be able to say in different ways. Thank you.
The next question asks, is there a process solution? Can methodologically flawed observational studies be filtered out more effectively by improving the standard reporting requirements on things that affect reproducibility when manuscripts are submitted, in this case, both to preprint servers and peer-reviewed journals? So is the answer in a set of criteria?
Is there a concert type diagram for observational studies? I probably should know that, but I don't.
There is. It's not that we were working with it pretty extensively, and in fact, it doesn't get to some of the problems we've seen during COVID. Let's put it that way. It's pretty general.
Well, I can say that with one of the retracted studies about hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, and this credit all goes to my colleague Denise Grady, who said who did not want to write about it because it was an observational study, and there have been a lot of observational studies, and we all knew what we needed were these randomized controlled trials, and that this wasn't getting us there. But as the journals are under competitive pressure and want to be first, we are also under competitive pressure, and other publications really blew up that study. I think someone called it the mother of all studies. It was blasted all over publications I won't name, but we were under competitive pressure to write about it. We wrote about it in a very cautious way with a lot of caveats and a lot of limitations included, but we did write about it.
Amy?
So this is something that at FDA we have been working on together with international colleagues across international colleagues across the world, and importantly coming up with additional more detailed reporting requirements. My concern becomes a process to develop more detailed reporting requirements that take a year to a year and a half does not help us within the context of COVID. So we need to take the current reporting requirements that we already have, so for example record, and work from there. We've been working on this within the context of the Evidence Accelerator, and have started to highlight this on some of the EA web pages. But importantly, this is something that I think the entire community needs to keep working on.
Magdalena, any comments?
I'm not sure whether you can hear me. I actually dropped out for a second altogether. Plenty of comments, actually. It's a shame about my connectivity. London is obviously not very well connected tonight. There were a number of comments that were made already, and I guess I would like to stress one in particular, and that's about adequate reporting of caveats. It's something that scientific journals are learning to do much more diligently and much better. There is additional talk, for example, of including caveats and limitations of studies as a requirement in the abstracts, which of course the vast majority of people read. Not everybody will read a whole paper, certainly not all the way to the bottom. I think that that's really absolutely essential. Every scientific study has its caveats, and we should absolutely bring them to the fore and work together, regardless of the medium, to make sure that whatever the space we have, we do have space to point them out to the readers. It will help us educate the general public. Now speaking to what Patti said, again, to understand that science has these uncertainty, and that's part and parcel of discovery and the statements that are being that we're making as we're moving towards a discovery or a treatment or whatever it may be. I will leave it here.
Thank you. Let me. Oh, did you have a comment?
Well, I just think adding limitations into the abstract is an outstanding idea. Also, because we're linking to papers often, but usually people can only get access to the abstract unless they subscribe to a journal. So if you could include that in an abstract, it'd be very helpful for the broader population.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing to that, and that is the limitations. It's great to add the limitations. We can put them in stories. but people don't always pay attention to them. You know, we can put them up prominently. They can read right over them. And I think we don't want that to be a substitute for, both in the journalistic stories and in scientific studies, a clear statement of what you found. What can you say about what the evidence shows, and not to overstep and then rely, you know, fall back on the limitations to value out, to say, oh yeah, but I mentioned the limitations. To be upfront in that statement in the abstract, you know, to not say more than the evidence allows you to say, but to say as much as you can.
Very good. Let me ask this in this final minutes, ask this last question, which I like because I can put an OHDSI plug at the end of it. A recent paper published in BMJ conducted systematic review and prediction models. They considered both preprint and peer-reviewed articles. They all were at high risk for bias. The question was, does that mean peer-reviewed articles have their own limitation? How can we better improve the trust and validity of science without enough time for review? The plug being that I think that some of the things I mentioned in my intro that OHDSI tries to do, that is pre-specified protocols, always a multi-institutional study, etc., you know, are the path to better rigor, but I'd like to hear from the panel. Amy?
So I'll start. You know, I think that the important sub-theme in the BMJ systematic review continues to be that it really is the totality of what's available in terms of scientifically conducted studies, and that studies that make it into the published literature hopefully have a bias themselves of being more representative of you know, truly credible scientific evidence, but that's not entirely the case, and the totality of information is critical. Therefore, it is really important that what we have here is a really solid understanding in a transparent way of how studies are done, what methods are reliable, and ultimately a transparent critique of studies through a variety of translators that help translate research findings into what does it mean for me.
So maybe if I can follow up, absolutely agree. There is an increasing interest in pre-registration of studies and protocols. Of course, clinical trials are in many ways a great example of it, but now I'm talking about many other studies. There is also increasing interest in registered reports, which is a particular format of publication, which initially took off in psychology, but is now spreading to other research disciplines, where again you upfront set out your methodology and design, and that is in fact what's being peer reviewed. So the emphasis in the whole process is very much on methodology and study design in a very transparent way, as opposed to on the actual outcome. So a number of directions of travel which are very positive with respect to what we're discussing here. And the final comment to make on, or rather to add to what Amy said, was is about these reporting summaries, which I referred to earlier, which I hope you heard. Indeed, very systematic reporting of what was done, how was done, and in what context, on what samples. That I think absolutely feeds into this question that we're discussing here.
Patti, did you still want to make a comment? And then we may need to sign off.
I was distracted by the last comment that came up about could we come up with another word besides preprint? Many of these never make it into publication. And we're finding one of our big challenges is to align the preprint with the archival article, and it's a one-to-many, many-to-many kind of relationship. But I think it's a term of art. It's sort of like someone else mentioned, clinicaltrials.gov is not the right place to record observational trials. We need an observationaltrials.gov type structure. And then it's actually looking at the portfolio of research declaration repositories because of this very need.
It's interesting you should say that, Patti, because data.ohdsi.org is precisely our clinicaltrials.gov, which contains, you know, we have the protocols on GitHub, and all the results, the 500,000 results were on the internet the instant they were generated. the papers came out a year later, as it takes time to interpret it. Anyway, thank you, panelists, so much for joining us. It's very nice of you to put your time into this. And thank you, everyone in the audience. And thank you for the questions, of which I could only get to a few. And enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thank you all.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.